Hey, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and in this video, we'll create a 12-column grid system using CSS. First, let's create a new container and give it a class of grid. Inside this container, I'll add 5 more containers. Right now, let's not add any classes to these containers and come back to them later. Head into your CSS and add the grid class. First, set the display property to grid, telling CSS that you want to use CSS grid. Next, we need to define our 12 columns using the grid template columns CSS property. In this property, we'll be using fractional units, which you can learn more about in the video at the end. To make our lives easier, we'll use the repeat CSS function to create 12 columns with a size of 1 fractional unit each. Setting this property will divide the grid into 12 equally sized responsive areas. Right now, it's hard to see our grid because there's no content inside. Let's add a couple classes that will set the grid height and background color to make it easier to see the grid. Then add these classes to the grid container. Now the grid is easier to see. To visualize the grid even better, you can inspect the page in Google Chrome and click on the Grid button next to the container in the Elements tab. Remember that the background color and height classes are only helpful for the example and unnecessary for the grid system itself. The next step is create more utility classes that we can use to set how many columns we want containers to take up on the grid. Let's make the first container take up the entire 12-column grid. We'll add a class to the first grid item and call it column 12. Then, inside our CSS, we'll style this class by setting the grid column property to the following value. The grid column property is a shorthand for setting the grid column start and the grid column end CSS properties. Both values are span 12, which tells CSS Grid that this container should span or extend across 12 columns. Also, note that a slash separates the values. This is important for writing the proper syntax. Like the grid, let's make it easier to see the 12-column container by creating a CSS class that sets the background color. Next, we'll repeat the process for the other column span styles. So far, our grid takes up the entire page width, but you'll often want to set a max width on your content. To demonstrate this, create a new grid with the same classes and add a new class called GridMax. Then style the GridMax class and set the max width property. To center the container horizontally on the page, set the margin to 0 and auto. These values will apply no margin to the top and bottom and set the left and right margin to auto, which will center the grid container on the page. Now, when we resize the browser, you'll see the container will reach a max width and be centered on the page as expected. Check out this video to learn more about how fractional units work. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.